All right, it is with my great pleasure to introduce Professor Devi Mays and Sarah J. Pearce on this session on myth-making and nationhood. We'll start out, the format will be slightly different. We'll be doing 15-minute or so presentations from the two, and then we'll open it up to questions after my questions in that format. So we would like it to be much more of a discussion between the panelists as well as the audience at large. So first off, we have Professor Devi Mays. She is an assistant professor of Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. Mays works on transnational Jewish networks in the Mediterranean and global context with a focus on Sephardic Jews in particular. After receiving her PhD in History and Jewish Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington, Mays was a postdoctoral fellow at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Her book project deals with Sephardic migrants between the Ottoman Empire, its successor states, and Mexico, studying the transnational identities, networks, and citizenships which they cultivated to circumvent restrictions imposed by the Ottoman, Mexican, and Turkish states. Her publications include, among many others, quote, "I Killed Her Because I Loved Her Too Much, Gender and Violence in the 20th Century, Sephardic Diaspora," and numerous translations into English from Ladino, Spanish, and French. Today she'll be discussing marking elite status, Sephardi opium dealers in the late Ottoman world.
Thank you, Bryan, for the generous introduction, and thank you to everybody who is attending here today, as well as to Ryan for running a wonderful institute this year. I'm not exactly at all a medievalist or early modernist, but I have learned so much from our conversations, and as a historian, I am generally wary of making broad linkages between 7 or 8 centuries. There are certain themes, I think, that come up in my work, in my paper here today, that do appear in other papers here as well. I don't want to claim that there's a direct connection between what is happening in the Iberian world of the medieval and early modern period and what we see happening in the late 19th and early 20th century, but I do think that there are some fruitful ideas to think about and think through. I also want to say that I have had so many ideas in the last 2 days based on our discussion here, to the extent that in the last Q&A I ran back to my office to check one of my primary sources and have sort of redone what I think the conclusions of these papers are, but it's all mental at this point. I haven't written them down, so bear with me as I try to talk these issues out based on our conversations the last 2 days. Okay. In 1922, 3 relatives by the name of Isaac, Albert, and Leon Taranto filed a complaint in the name of the firm of Nissim Taranto in the United States District Court of the Southern District of New York, which we've heard a lot about recently for other reasons. And this complaint was against the firm of L&E Frankel, with an E, not an A, so not the same family that is sponsoring our conference here. In their complaint, the Tarantos, who were all relations in some way of Nissim Taranto, their exact relative status isn't entirely clear, they alleged that the Frankels had reneged fraudulently on their contract to become the exclusive agent for the sale of opium that the Tarantos were supplying, and which originated in the Tarantos' home country of what the U.S. District Court defined as the Turkish Empire. So this is 1922. It's not really clear what's going on in what had been the Ottoman Empire. There is no Turkey yet. It's unclear. In his majority opinion, Judge Learned Hand, who would later serve on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, examined several issues at the heart of the case. First was the question of whether or not the plaintiffs had been properly licensed to conduct trade in opium, which by now was a substance whose importation into the United States was restricted to what was deemed to be medically necessary amounts. Hand established that American restrictions on opium did not apply in this case. Though Leon Taranto's business was registered in New York, and at the time Leon Taranto was living in New York, the contract between Leon and Emmanuel Frankel had been drawn up in Paris, and the opium in question was intended for importation into Japan, not into the United States. Jurisdiction established, Hand moved on to the next issue, that the defendants were trying to have the case dismissed on the grounds that the Tarantos were heimatlos, or without nationality, a status increasingly common after the conflagration of the Great War killed millions and scattered millions of others across borders and polities that had been shredded and recast or were in the process of being recast. The defendants noted that at various points since the outbreak of World War I, Leon Taranto had traveled through Europe and to the United States on papers that ranged from Austrian to French to Turkish. Prior to this, he had been a French protégé rather than a French national, a distinction that Sarah Stein has shown was highly meaningful at the same time as its meaning was unclear to bearers and issuers of that status alike. According to Learned Hand, it was therefore necessary to ascertain the nationality of the Tarantos by looking to their personal and family history. The plaintiffs are all, he wrote, Sephardic Jews, born and living in Constantinople. Their family history goes back to an expulsion from Spain in the 15th century, which is probably correct, as that was the source of most of the Jewish population of Constantinople. All he saw, he explained, was, quote, an entire readiness to assume any nationality which would best fit in with his purpose at the time. However lacking in uprightness that might be thought to be in others, it was certainly no sign of obliquity in him. He and his fathers had no reason to love any of the sovereigns of Europe, or to do more than attach themselves to that one for who the time being would be most likely to give them tolerable protection. This family history of expulsion had shaped a distrust of European rulers and European governments, but the resultant accrual of protege and nationality statuses did not diminish their credibility in the judge's eyes. Judge Learned Hand's ruling in favor of the Tarantos highlighted their Sephardi lineage and the legal legacies of expulsion centuries before. The details of the case, meanwhile, involved a trade in opium, a product which, like the Tarantos' nationality, crossed borders entangled with overlapping and at times contradictory legal regimes. Sephardi Jews, like other Jews, including the Romanian Immanuel Frankel, were engaged in the trade of opium and other white drugs. At no time did Jews, including Sephardi Jews or otherwise, monopolize the drug trade, and it is not the intention of the paper to suggest that they did, although in his opinion, Learned Hand mentioned that the Taranto family at this time did in fact monopolize the opium coming out of the Turkish Empire. There were, however, Sephardi Jews who held prominent roles within various stages of the manufacturing, trade, and distribution of opiates over the course of several centuries. And this paper explores the involvement of Sephardi Jews in the opiate trade, not to argue that this was a Sephardi or Jewish monopoly, but rather as a lens into broader component parts of Sephardi experiences and identities in the 19th and 20th century. And I'm going to come back in the conclusion to complicate some of these terms based on our discussions the last few days, but I couldn't rewrite the entire paper in the last 2 hours. In particular, this paper focuses on the history and connections of one particular Sephardi family, the Tarantos, who held a prominent position in the opium trade from its beginning in Ottoman Anatolia of the early 19th century. More particularly, it looks at the ways in which a family, the Taranto family in particular, crafted for themselves an elite status at the confluence of opium and empire, a status threatened by the gradual restrictions against opium and its byproducts. While today there are many moral and legal judgments that are associated with the opiate trade, whether opium, heroin, or most recently OxyContin and the Sackler family, synthetic opium scandal that's occurring, for much of its history, this trade was fully legal and highly lucrative. And successful merchants took on prominent roles in the Ottoman Jewish community and as intermediaries between the Ottoman Jewish community and the broader Ottoman government, as well as networks going out of the Ottoman Empire and extra Jewish and extra Ottoman networks. So this paper attempts to take these merchants on their own terms to understand their actions and activities at the intersection of Ottoman and Jewish history, and to avoid projecting presentist moralism back onto their actions. So to try to take them, see what they were doing at the time they were doing it, and not necessarily view it as has often been done in studies of the trade in opiates as them being involved in trades that were contraband or part of a broader network of mobsters or organized crime. So, among Sephardi Jews, the intersection of elite status, family name, and perceived honor were oft lauded and intertwined, and this came up in Mark's papers in the last session, but is still valid, or I find it quite a lot appearing in 19th and 20th century sources. While scholars have explored how early modern Ottoman Jewish notions of honor drew on an Iberian heritage, notions of behavioral respectability, social status, and money, there has been little exploration of the ways in which these concepts were employed or discarded among late Ottoman Jews. Even the oft-used phrase in Ladino, basta que sos a bravanel, or it is enough that you are a bravanel, emphasized the importance of family lineage. Other factors, including the French protege status to which Learned Hand referred, also came to bolster elite status among Sephardim in the Ottoman and post-Ottoman worlds. Late Ottoman Jewish society was notoriously class-conscious, and the lack of social mobility was actually often cited as a cause or an impetus of emigration for Jews to want to leave the Ottoman Empire. The conflation of wealth and the broader honor of the family, and there are distinctions between sort of masculine concepts of honor and feminine concepts of honor that I don't get into in this paper, but that does play a role, also appears in the Ladino literature of the early 20th century. So one Ladino novella, for example, published in 1910, noted that, quote, among our Jews of the Orient, poor families are counted among the low class. And it was rare for marriages to be contracted across social class. And the same author brought up also that, quote, this our rich Jews never do. Perhaps Christians do this, or German Jews, but our Spanish Jews never. And it uses the phrase judíos españoles for this, to talk about the actions of the Jews of the Orient, or the Ladino-speaking world, which they call the Orient. And this novel is actually set in Bulgaria and Vienna, so it's the boundaries of what precisely the Orient aren't precisely clear. The Toronto family parlayed success in the opium trade into elite status, but wealth and name alone did not ensure this notability, particularly given the nature of their trade in the face of the profound upheavals in political, economic, and legal regimes in the aftermath of World War I. And this paper focuses on the pre-World War I period, but I'd be very happy to address in Q&A what comes afterwards. As opium and its derivatives became increasingly illegal, the Toronto status became increasingly uncertain. And I think going back to one of the questions that Jeff raised yesterday, when status becomes uncertain, that's when people really bear down on this question of identity and how to categorize themselves and place themselves within a world. If, in the case of the U.S. Southern District of New York, the Torontos proved successful at defending their interests before a judge sympathetic to the legacy of expulsion, such success was not assured and actually over time became less and less certain. So within the Ottoman Empire, the cities of Izmir and Istanbul, and to a lesser extent Salonika, were critical to the opium trade. And you can see on the map, somewhere in eastern or western Anatolia, there's a city that's labeled on this map as Afyon Karahisar, which literally means poppy or opium black fortress. And it's still that area where much of the opium was produced. And actually much of today's legal opium still comes from this particular region of Anatolia. Ottoman poppies contained high levels of morphine, which made Anatolian opium particularly desirable for refinement into opiates like morphine or heroin. In the early 1800s, merchants, who were predominantly Armenians of Ottoman origin, purchased opium at weekly markets in the Anatolian interior and would then bring them to licensed brokers who were predominantly Jews who worked for firms in Izmir. So Izmir was the early center of the opium trade. As increasing European and American demand for Anatolian opium expanded, merchants in Ottoman Izmir became increasingly interested in the lucrative trade and petitioned the Sultan to be allowed to act as brokers. In 1811, for example, a Jewish broker's petition to the Sultan was approved amidst the protest of several other potential brokers. The Jewish broker agreed to supply the Vakif, or a religious trust of Istanbul's Laleli Mosque, with 150 okas, which was an Ottoman unit of mass measurement of olive oil. in lieu of license fees. So you see different types of materials being used, but also here that these Ottoman opium merchants are endowing a mosque in Istanbul. And even here we get a sense of the connections formed between opium traders and the Ottoman state that hinged upon different types of mutual benefit. The final purchaser of the opium tended to would bring the opium before an experienced public examiner, who then checked opium by color, smell, and texture in exchange for a commission of 0.5% of the selling price from the buyer and a ball of opium per bag from the seller. And here is actually a picture of Nissim Taranto is the man standing on the left, and you see those boxes with these balls in them. Those are balls of opium. So this is the form that opium took. In the first half of the 19th century, the opium examiners in Istanbul were Bohor Taranto and Ishak Abulafia, and they were assisted by Bohor's son Nissim and another man by the name of Hayim Gabay. As the names all suggest, these men were Jewish. And the prominence of these families in the opium trade continued well into the 20th century. So we tend to see the same families being involved in this trade over time, whether it's in Izmir, in Salonika, or in Bulgaria. I mean, it was all the Ottoman Empire, but as they became different states, it's the same families. In 1831, the Ottoman Empire moved the opium depot to Istanbul and created a monopoly over it, and Bohor Taranto, who was accompanied by his son Nissim, was appointed the monopoly's official inspector in the Ottoman capital. Abulafia and Gabay, meanwhile, remained as inspectors in Izmir. And in 1913, a French publication on opium commerce in Turkey, which is where this image comes from, noted that several years before, 2/3 of the opium trade in Constantinople passed through the company belonging to Nissim Taranto and his sons. Nissim, noted the publication, was one of the first to give any importance to the subject and therefore possessed the oldest laboratory in the city dedicated to that trade. And I should note that this Nissim Taranto is not the original Nissim Taranto, but as there are many Todroses and Bialans, there are also many Nissim Tarantos in this paper. Members of the Taranto family, like those of other prominent opium families, used their success to achieve standing and even leadership in the broader Jewish community, cementing their status as communal and social elites. They were among the earliest initiates into Istanbul's B'nai B'rith Lodge, and here is a photograph. It comes from the American Jewish Archives, which now have the records of Constantinople's B'nai B'rith Lodge. And you see here that Nissim Taranto joined the lodge in 1911, so he's one of the earliest members to join this lodge. He's listed as a businessman or a negociant, and lived in Karaköy on the Moda, really, on the Asian side of Istanbul, but his business was located in Istanbul, which means particularly within the walls of the old city. Okay. So we see here his photograph is listed, and other members of the family were listed as members of the lodge as well, but only Nissim had his photograph in the booklet. They were participants and even the president of l'Amicale, which was an organization for the alumni of the schools of the Alliance Israélite Universelle. They held positions on the lay council of the Jewish community, representing Jews of the Sephardic rite, in the particularly bourgeois neighborhood of Galata Perashishli in Istanbul. They were on the boards of the Hayim Jewish National Hospital in Balat in Istanbul. And one of them even became president of an organization called B'nai Israel, which was founded after World War I and aimed to inculcate a strong sense of Jewish national feeling in work of establishing, quote, a national Jewish Ottoman state, even as it encouraged Jews to conserve their rights and duties to the countries they inhabited. Serving on the boards of institutions for communal government and healthcare and holding membership in elite social clubs were not the sole means that the Tarantos used to inscribe their prominence in the public sphere. Philanthropy was another crucial means of demonstrating their status. They regularly donated opium to the various hospitals of the Ottoman capital, using some of the products they received in recompense for inspecting opium for export to benefit public health. The Ladino periodical El Tiempo lauded their largesse as an example to, quote, be imitated by others who are in the state of being able to do so. They also gave large monetary donations to an array of Jewish institutions, including the Jewish hospital and the Jewish orphanage, residents of poor Jewish neighborhoods throughout Constantinople, and the schools of the Alliance Israélite Universelle. Oftentimes, these donations were made in the name of deceased family members or in memoriam for other prominent members of Istanbul's Sephardi and Italian Jewish communities. As well as prominent members of the European Christian elite in the city, the so-called category of Levantinos, the Ottoman category of Levantinos, not the way Matthias uses it. So when one of the Tarantos, one of Nissim's son Vitali, died in July of 1913 at the age of 27, that served as a reason to make prominent donations to an array of Jewish causes. And his death was widely reported in the Ladino press, which noted that, quote, many people, not only from our community, but other confessions as well, attended the funeral. And that, quote, Taranto passed his time with his family studying and cultivating flowers. Which sounds very pleasant. In the newspaper, in the obituary, they say flowers. They don't say what type of flowers. Donations, as well as publicized obituaries and marriages. So there are a lot of things of the Tarantos getting married or people dying who were married into the Taranto family or Tarantos dying, were widely reported in the Ladino and French press of the capital and the wider Eastern Mediterranean Jewish world. So there are reports of this family published in French language newspapers, Jewish newspapers in Alexandria, for example. Men of the Taranto family also made use of their communal status to pursue political activities, thereby bolstering this elite status. Isaac Taranto had been a legal counselor with the Ottoman Foreign Ministry prior to the outbreak of World War I, and he had given large donations in favor of broader Ottoman war efforts, not only the Ottoman Jewish community. Meanwhile, upon Ottoman entry into the war, the Committee for Union and Progress attempted to use Leon Taranto as an intermediary between the Ottoman Empire and Great Britain in hopes of negotiating peace between the two states. Indeed, it was precisely Leon Taranto's opium connections that primed him for this failed attempt. Taranto traveled to Salonika, which had been annexed to Greece after the Balkan Wars several years earlier. There he met with his counterparts in the British opium firm of Whittall and Company. And I should note that one of the brain sparks that I had at 4 a.m. was that the Whittalls, so the Tarantos also made large donations when one of the Whittalls died to Jewish and non-Jewish causes throughout the city. And they lived in the same district of Istanbul, in Moda. So both the Whittalls and the Tarantos lived in this sort of upper class neighborhood of Istanbul as well. So several years before, Nissim and Vitali Taranto had held a subscription drive to benefit Jewish, Armenian, and Greek Orthodox hospitals in honor of the memory of William Whittall, who was a British subject of a family that had been in the Ottoman Empire for generations, first in Izmir and then in Istanbul. And this was the family who owned Whittall and Company. So the Tarantos and the Whittalls have a long, which I need to explore more, a long trajectory or a long history of interactions with each other that were used in this failed attempt to broker peace between the Ottoman Empire and the British Empire and World War I. So following World War I, even as the Ottoman Empire was in disarray and the future of its territories uncertain, the Tarantos remained involved in political negotiations. So in 1919, Isaac Taranto, in his capacity as the president of L'Amical and the Bnei Israel Association, was one of the handful of Turkish Jewish leaders who met with an American commission appointed by President Woodrow Wilson to meet with various peoples of formerly Ottoman lands and to decide what the fate of the Ottoman Empire should be. This commission sought to ascertain the views of various local communities with respect to the installation of a mandatory power over the region. With respect to Turkey, the Jewish delegation did not express a preference for any particular mandatory power, but rather expressed a desire for the recognition and protection of national minorities and their religious, ethnic, national, and linguistic rights. And when Chief Rabbi Nahum, Hayim Nahum of the Ottoman Empire, visited the United States in 1921 as his part of a mission to engage with Sephardi communities in the United States and to advocate for Turkish interests specifically, It was Leon Taranto's, quote, very luxurious office at the center of town in Manhattan, which was his temporary address. And Taranto gave him room there to receive visitors. So the Tarantos transformed prominence in the opium trade into visibility within the Ottoman Jewish and broader Ottoman worlds, and status was created and marked through the accrual of wealth, marriage alliances, which I didn't really talk about here, and the parlaying of wealth into positions of power and proximity to different forms of authority, whether it was rabbinic authority, various types of governmental authorities, etc. Through the organizations in which they were engaged, their prominent donations to Jewish and non-Jewish causes, and the political connections they forged, the Tarantos marked themselves as elite members of the Jewish community, with a clear vision of themselves both as Ottomans and Jews. And it's here where I'm diverging from the end of the paper that I had written and sort of raising some other questions that have come up in my mind as a result of our conversations here. This is another member of the Taranto family still in Izmir, that they're exporters of opium, and you can see here the poppy fields. So they issue these postcards to advertise their activities. And here's another postcard of the same Taranto family. And I believe I would guess that the man with the boat hat is one of the Tarantos, or certainly not one of the people who is cultivating opium poppies. These are avenues of further exploration for me. This is a very early stage of this project. One of the other places that this project goes has to do with this massive bust of heroin in 1932 in New York, where you can see here two men claiming shipment from Istanbul were arrested at the Brooklyn Pier, and the two men, Naftali Ojalvo, who said he was a native of Mexico and gave his Manhattan address, and Isaac Sevilla, who said he was born in Spain, also living in Manhattan. The two men were actually both from Constantinople. It's unclear how Sevilla got Spanish citizenship, but he was traveling on Spanish papers at this point. Both of the men lived in Mexico. They ended up not being, they were arrested but not charged because they claimed they were claiming the shipment for a stranger they had met in Paris, and they were doing him a favor, and there wasn't enough evidence to link them to this crime. But nonetheless, the US still explored these connections, and here is a piece of the wax that encased the tins of heroin that was then cut out and shipped back to the American consulate in Constantinople, which I found in the archives. It's one of my more exciting archival finds. So there are these sort of networks of smuggling, and where the borders between legality and illegality get blurred, and also moving forward after the end of the Ottoman Empire. The ways in which the Tarantos framed their activities and were very, even in the Turkish press, so writing opinion pieces defending themselves and their actions in Cumhuriyet, in a newspaper associated with Ataturk, or with close relationships with the Committee for, or the Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi, the Republican People's Party. And the editor of that paper, Yunus Nadi, was also a financier of their opium company. So the webs there are, there are more webs to explore there. But as I was thinking, based on our conversations yesterday and today, so Judge Learned Hand in this ruling makes this case for the Tarantos being Sephardic Jews, right? And that makes sense for why they're switching up nationalities, and that there's nothing dishonorable in them doing that. And the reason I ran away during the end of last presentation was that I wanted to check back in the briefing, in his opinion, and to see who he cited in that. And it wasn't the Tarantos. He wasn't saying the Tarantos claimed that they were Sephardic or that they were Spanish in putting forth this claim, but he's quoting or citing French language sources on the status of religious minorities in the Ottoman Empire, and then revisions of those legal statuses of religious minorities in the Ottoman Empire after the Ottoman nationality law of 1869. So it's not clear that the Torontos are making that claim about themselves, or that they're making claims on Sephardic identity or the specific heritage as being important for their actions. But I think it is noteworthy to note that other people are making that claim on their behalf, and who they're going to look for that. So I'm just throwing that out there because this is a thought I had in the last, the last few hours. But thinking about these broader questions of Sephardi identity and the ways in which this myth-making of Sephardi identity is employed in the 19th and 20th century, it's not always clear that it's those we would categorize as Sephardic Jews themselves who are making those claims on behalf of themselves. But here it does bear very much on their legal status, that others make those claims for them. And where I think we can say that other parts of claiming a sort of something we could consider maybe a Sephardi as being fruitful in this is the discussion of the prominence of elites and looking at these sort of networks of commerce and marriage that we often, and sort of international trade that we often associate with the early modern Mediterranean, that we can still draw through into the 19th and 20th century in these opium networks that are existing throughout the Mediterranean at this point across the Atlantic. So maybe to think about if we can actually draw distinctions when it comes to Mediterranean Jewry between early modern and modern economic activities and commercial activities and the creation of elite status. So I'll drop it there. Thank you all for bearing with me.
Thank you, Devi. Now we know why the TSA asks us, did you pack your own bag? So next up we have Professor Sarah J. Pearce. She's an associate professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at New York University, where her teaching and research focuses on the intellectual history and literature of Jews, Christians, and Muslims in medieval Spain. Her first book, The Andalusi Literary and Intellectual Tradition, The Role of Arabic in Judah ibn Tibbon's Ethical Will, examines the ways in which Jewish intellectuals in the 13th century Spain and France understood Arabic to be a language of cultural prestige. She is also the recipient of the Michael Camille Memorial Essay Prize in 2014 and the John K. Walsh Article Prize awarded by the MLA Forum on Medieval Iberia. This year we've had the great fortune of having Pearce at the Frankel Institute, and we'll be hearing some of her recent research on Cervantes, Don Quixote, and Hayim, Nahman, Bialik. So give her a round of applause and introduction. Hang on. Yes! It's that one. There we go. Okay. Too many things at once. It's not there yet.
So I'd just like to join in the chorus of thanks to Jeff and to Ryan for creating such a stimulating intellectual environment over the course of the year. To Mary, Sherry, Kelsey, and Michael for shepherding a cohort of absent-minded professors and just making it very easy for us. And of course to acknowledge the Frankel family for making this possible. I'm just going to begin by situating my project, my remarks in the context of the broader project that I've been working on this year. And also just note that some of my colleagues have presented refined and polished versions of what they presented in our seminar, sort of edited based on our discussions. And other colleagues have presented sort of newer work. And I fall very firmly in the latter category. This is the broad strokes beginning stages of a chapter from a book project that I've been working on this year, looking at the ways in which the figure of the medieval Andalusi poet-statesman and his oeuvre would ultimately be leveraged in nationalist discourses in the 19th and 20th centuries in communities that made some kind of linguistic, historical, or cultural claim to Spain. So this is a new project, and for me as a medievalist, a new chronotrope working in the modern period. So I'll very much welcome your feedback at the end. So with all of that said, the Hebrew poet Hayim Nahman Bialik, even before his death and before the establishment of the State of Israel, was referred to as Hamshor HaLeumi, the national poet. A contemporary of Eliezer ben Yehuda, Bialik too played a role in the development of a Hebrew linguistic and literary culture in the late 19th and early 20th century Palestine. That he was given national designation before the establishment of the State of Israel suggests popular desire not only for Jewish statehood, but also perhaps more saliently for a kind of Hebrew cultural nationalism represented by the existence of a literary elite and a canon of Hebrew literature. Oops. This is a bit sensitive. Bialik's career was wide and multifaceted, and I will mention just 3 of his own contributions to the Hebrew canon. As a poet who returned to and rejected classical modes of Hebrew writing to express his perspectives from a modern world. As a translator who brought classics of world literature into the Hebrew orbit, and as an editor of medieval Hebrew poetry. In each of these 3 elements, we find striking connections to the literary traditions of Spain, and the extraordinary potential for revisiting Sfarad as part of a Hebrew cultural national discourse. Like his medieval predecessors, he adopts the poetic voice of a bellicose prophet. As an editor and publisher, he battled the academic establishment in pre-state Palestine to assert the importance of working poets in the early study of medieval Hebrew poetry, the medieval Hebrew poetry of Spain. And as a translator, he rendered into Hebrew the great Spanish novel about translation, Miguel Cervantes' Don Quixote, a page of the draft of which is in the center. The other elements are from his edition of Ibn Gabirol, and then just the little archival folder marker. Bialik saw the translation of the classics of European literature as an integral part of creating a Hebrew canon and fortifying the modern Hebrew language. Under the auspices of this program, a Hebrew translation of Don Quixote was offered to his Odessa-based publishing house, Turgaman, in 1910. However, he found it to be so lacking that rather than edit the translation that was submitted to him as editor and publisher, he decided to undertake the translation himself. It was published by Turgaman in 1912 and then republished in Tel Aviv by Devi several times throughout the 1920s in various editions. The final version is radically abridged, an important feature to which I will return shortly. One of the great conceits of Cervantes' original is that it is a mere transcription and Castilian translation of the chronicle of the Arab historian Sidemete Benengeli. In case anyone here is not familiar with the novel, it begins with a preface written in the voice of a fictionalized narrator named Miguel Cervantes, who claims some but hardly all responsibility for the book. Famously, he explains that although I may appear to be the father of the book, I am the stepfather. The reader comes to see exactly what this narrator means when the story of the book-mad knight-errant, inspired by chivalric romances such as Amadis de Gaula, ends abruptly at the end of chapter 8 because, this same narrator tells us, the manuscript ran out and so he has no more story to relate. In the following chapter, we see him go out into the marketplace of Toledo for a walk and discover by chance a boy selling paper with Arabic characters on it for rag. The narrator buys up the pages and takes them to a Morisco, a crypto-Muslim who knew Castilian but could also read the Arabic characters of the text, to be translated. He realizes that this is a continuation of the story of Don Quixote when the narrator mentions a marginal note that reveals that Dulcinea, his great love, is claimed to have had the best hand at salting pork in the whole region. After the Morisco completes and delivers the translation, the rest of the novel continues where it left off, with Don Quixote battling a Basque soldier, ostensibly with the narrator Cervantes sharing the translated manuscript with us. As a literary device, as a refinement of the medieval frame tale, and as a glimpse at some of the socio-political realities against which the flesh and blood author Cervantes found himself both fighting and writing as a soldier adib, the frame is perhaps the most important element of the novel. And yet that very frame, the fictionalized explanation of the novel's provenance, offered to the reader by the fictionalized personage of the author, is the first thing to go in Bialik's abridgment of the novel, the most important thing that he would deem unimportant. A note that is itself very Cervantine appears at the beginning of the novel and explains roughly Bialik's editorial approach to the translation and abridgment. The Hebrew translation, it says, was made from the new edition of the complete translation of Don Quixote in 2 volumes, which, according to Cervantistas, is the correct one to use, being the cleanest and freest from changes and addition from foreign hands. Because this translation is principally destined for young people, there are many omissions and abridgments. In particular, all of the episodes that are not directly related to the body of the story and might obscure the reader's appreciation of what is important have been omitted. The note, although apparently informational in nature, cannot but evoke the fictional paratextual elements of the original novel. Here is an explanation, more or less putatively written in the voice of the author, explaining the origins of the text and how it came to be in the language in which the reader would encounter it. It also begins to shed some light on Bialik's priorities as a translator of the work. He writes that he was working from a complete translation, emphasizing that people in the know considered it to be the freest from outside influences. Mariana Prigozhina has determined that he was working with both complete Russian and German translations, as well as with a popular abridged Russian translation that apparently inadvertently changed the gender of several minor characters and introduced several new ones, making it very easy to track the abridgments spread in the world. Any version that has those changes comes from that Russian abridgment. I would just add a few notes from the work in progress here, the work in progress sort of piece of this. One is that I have yet to ascertain who are these Cervantistas, real or imagined, with opinions about Russian translations of Don Quixote, with whom Bialik would have been in contact. Two, I describe Bialik's prefatory note as apparently informational in nature, because I'm left with some questions about Prigozhina's assessment of Bialik's sources. And three, the only edition of the Quixote in a European language to have survived several decades of neglect in the library in Bialik's study in the House Museum is an abridged German one that has no annotations of any kind. And so the answers to Bialik's sources are unlikely to be found in the library as it exists today. But with those caveats aside, although he was working, at least in consultation with an abridged version, he tells us that he himself abridged the Hebrew version from a complete edition, and that even without the Spanish original, fidelity to it was amongst his most important considerations. The question of freedom from foreign influence is particularly noteworthy within Bialik's overall attitude toward translation, as it was likewise something he tried to avoid importing into his Hebrew translations themselves, working from and toward an ideal of translation as a phenomenon of pure text rather than a phenomenon of culture. It is also worth mentioning, though, that this language suggestively echoes that of Cervantes, the fictional narrator, who beseeches the Morisco translator to, and I'm quoting here in Edith Grossman's translation, render all the journals, all those that dealt with Don Quixote, into the Castilian language without taking away or adding anything to them. And this sort of evocativeness of language is one of the things that, for me, raises a little bit of question about what that note is doing at the beginning. So in spite of the coincidence of Bialik's views on translation with those of Cervantes, the narrator, it is precisely both Spain and the Sephardi that are casualties of the abridgment and perhaps of the process of translating from a translation. As a consequence of eliminating the frame, the reader also loses one of the most significant references to Don Quixote's imagined lover, Dulcinea del Toboso. In 1926, the literary historian Americo Castro proposed that the detail about Dulcinea, that she had the best hand for salting pork in all of La Mancha, is a not-so-subtle signal that her character is a crypto-Jew, making a very public show of not adhering to Jewish dietary laws for the benefit of her neighbors and the Inquisition. The loss of the frame serves the interests of turning a literarily and culturally complex work into a set of amusing tales appropriate for children, and of introducing the most European elements of European literature into Hebrew. Knights errant in shining armor, rather than itinerant Arab historians, their Castilian translators, and their audience of Jews and Muslims desperately trying to prove themselves to be anything but. Dulcinea the Crypto-Jew is gone from the Hebrew version of the novel, along with every other trace of what Castro would have described as Spain's, quote, Semitic heritage. The literary historical chronology is such that stripping out these traits from the novel likely cannot be seen as a deliberately anti-Sephardic move. There's no evidence that Bialik himself independently identified Dulcinea as a Spanish Jew forced to convert or hide her faith. And again, this assessment may change once I'm better able to assess the community of Cervantistas with whom Bialik was in communication. Nevertheless, for readers in the post-Castro era, for whom the idea of Dulcinea as a conversa has been widely accepted and popularized, the book reads as a heavy-handed de-Judaizing of a 17th century Spain and an elimination of the seeds of the Sephardic diaspora as they appear in Don Quixote. Bialik's fraught relationship with and dismissive attitudes towards the Sephardi communities of pre-state Palestine is well documented and well-trodden scholarly territory. Fascinatingly for the medievalist, he is even purported to have used the term Franks to refer to the Sephardi Jews of his own era. But it would be a step too far to say that the loss of Dulcinea de Conversa from the Hebrew Quixote is truly reflective of Bialik's anti-Sephardi attitude. Where his translation of the Quixote and of Dulcinea in particular is concerned, the nature of the evidence available necessarily limits my intervention to the literary critical rather than to a more full-ranging historical analysis. The surviving evidence of Bialik's translation of the Quixote does not allow for sustaining claims about Bialik's editorial process as a deliberate de-Sephardification of the novel, concomitant to his views of Sephardi Jews as inferior to Ashkenazi ones. Rather, we're left to interrogate the text and the impact of Bialik's editorial decisions on how we read and receive the Sephardic in this version of the novel, and how all of this fits into the questions of Spanishness, Sephardiness, and national mythology in pre-state Hebrew literature. When writing in English, we tend to use the word Sfarad to refer to a kind of cultural imaginary and reserve terms like Spain or Iberia as toponyms situated in a realidad histórica, to borrow again from Castro. Whereas when writing in Hebrew or dealing with Hebrew writers, we have no choice but to confront the double valence that encompasses both of these senses in the word Sfarad. Because of this, and especially in light of Professor Bodian's keynote yesterday, challenging the coherence and the community interiority of the very idea of Sephardi identity, I want to be very clear about the three distinct senses of Sephardi culture that may be in play here. First is Sfarad as coterminous with Al-Andalus, the place with the courtiers and the poets at the cutting edge of the legal and liturgical world, self-assuredly exceptional. Second is the Sephardi diaspora, the Jews expelled in 1492 and their descendants, as well as those on the cusp of it hiding their religion and developing a separate kind of crypto-Jewish set of practices. And the third is Sfarad in the sense of the modern state of Spain, a place that has alternatively, and depending upon who you ask, selectively embraced its medieval past, negated and revised it. It is this third Sfarad that is the part of Europe whose literary culture Bialik hoped to import into Hebrew, rather than the other two. Bialik, as the editor of Ibn Gabirol and Moshe ben Ezra's poetic diwans, and as the would-be editor of the so-called Sassoon manuscript that was the window into much of the Hebrew poetry of Sfarad prior to the rediscovery of more of it from within the cache of the Cairo Geniza later in the 20th century. He was intimately familiar with the Andalusi mode of Hebrew poetry and poetics, and with its potential to allow not only for the creation of a canon of lasting works, but to allow Jewish literary interests to flourish within the aesthetic sensibilities of the dominant culture of their place and time. In Bialik's original poetry, both in Hebrew and in Yiddish, he adopts a prophetic poetic voice in response to war that echoes the voice adopted by Ibn Navrila. He even talks about the creation of Hebrew literature through translation in the same terms as several of his medieval predecessors, although to opposite ends. Whereas medieval translators, poets, and critics understood themselves to be dressing Hebrew and Arabic literature in Hebrew garb, Bialik wrote about Hebrew literature now dressing itself in its own garb. Yet, as Lital Levy has demonstrated, particularly through her reading of Bialik's correspondence with the Iraqi poet David Semach, Bialik himself mostly did not operate as a poet in the Andalusi or Sephardi mode. And even when he takes on the voice of the poet-prophet, it is as a European romantic rather than as a Sephardi poet general. This carries over into his translations. Even where he has opportunities within the translation of Don Quixote to use literary, linguistic, and especially poetic modes from the classical period of Jewish literature in Sfarad, he doesn't. That was the Dulcinea slide with the bit where the translator comes to mention what he's seeing, and sort of in another moment of kind of fictionalizing the history of Spain for touristic purposes. Those two pictures are actually from the Casa Museo de Dulcinea del Toboso, as if she could have a house museum. But in any event, as I said, this carries over into Bialik's translations, this kind of rejection of the Sephardi in favor of the Spanish. The poetry, both translated within and added into the novel, do not reflect classical medieval modes of Hebrew poetry. Bialik does not connect Cervantes' Spain with the medieval past that is so clearly present in the novel, nor does he seek to Judaize that medieval past, as a reader might expect. That was certainly my expectation when I first approached the text. But rather, he renders it within its perhaps more sterile European potentialities. Bialik's Quixote, then, unlike the original, is not a novel with room for Sephardi identities. They are not there in the sense of those belonging to the crypto-Jews in late medieval and early modern Spain and their double diasporic descendants. And although the use of biblical and especially prophetic language in his translation, just as an aside, Bialik's Quixote sounds a lot less like Amadís de Gaula and a lot more like Ezekiel. In spite of that, and in spite of all of the poetic opportunities that the novel presents, here too, Bialik does not recourse to Sfarad or its diaspora as a cultural source for his translations of the poetry. And as you can see here, this is the Discourse of Montesinos, rendered in verse, not in meter, with the exception of a couple of lines, sort of 2/3 of the way down, not in rhyme. He's writing in modern European modes. So it's this third sense of Sfarad to which Bialik's Hebrew Quixote ultimately belongs. It is Castilian without being Sephardi, and it is it's a very Castilian rendering of the great novel of Spanish modernity, to use an expression that will make all of the medievalists in the room roll their eyes. All the same, it is impossible to disentangle Bialik from the first sense of the Sephardi, that is, the Andalusi and the poetic. This entanglement is manifest in many ways. For example, one of Bialik's biographers, Josef Klausner, compares Bialik explicitly with Judah Halevi. I'm quoting a bit from Klausner's biography. Chaim Nahman Bialik was an extraordinary phenomenon in literature. Usually, a poet who is of real talent finds at the beginning, together with admirers among his contemporaries, great opponents who attack his poetic works, denying his talent, and only after a long war he becomes respected by everyone. Bialik has no opponents. In this respect, he resembles Rabbi Judah Halevi. Like him, Bialik dove into the Jewish nation's soul and raised precious pearls from it. Therefore, whoever possesses even one spark of the nation's soul cannot refrain from kneeling before this great national talent, before the real Jewish poet who is more than a mere artist. Veering towards the hagiographic. But in addition to that, to the reader familiar with medieval literature and its historiography, the idea that Halevi had no challengers also rings hollow, as his contemporaries challenged his proto-Zionist, which is a term I use here very advisedly, his proto-Zionist idealism in the face of a rich cultural and religious world that his contemporaries and indeed his challengers saw themselves as inhabiting in Al-Andalus. A far more intriguing and fruitful comparison between Bialik and Halevi might be in each man's version of an indigenously Jewish form of writing and his struggles with and against the reigning cultural forms that both enabled and restricted that writing. In the limited context in which he is wearing his translator's cap, Bialik in fact surpasses Halevi as a cultural phenomenon. Where Halevi was bound to Sephardi poetic modes in order to reject Sfarad, Bialik succeeds in asserting Hebrew cultural nationalism by rejecting Jewish Spain, its descendants, and all of its medieval literary modalities. That's it.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'll invite the other panelists to come up. I just have let's see here. Yo. So it's not so distracting. Does your microphone work? Here's this. Here's this. No, you just turned it off. Oh, no.
I didn't.
Oh, okay. Wonderful. Okay. So I have one general question for both of you in terms of thinking about, myth making within the Sephardic community, or using Sephardic Jews in order to create a myth for various nation states. So within Devi's paper, we have kind of this use by Judge Hand, a learned hand, taken from France or French literature, or French texts in this sense, to imagine who these Jews are, at this moment of collapse of an empire, of various empires and various nation states in that sense, and then a recreation during that period of time. And in the same case, with Sarah, you have this kind of moment of time, a transitional moment in time in which Jews are imagining that they're recreating another nation state after its collapse in that sense, right? And so then thinking about the sources that are available, I was very curious about the role of gender in this, and how that's performed, and how that kind of like influences how we imagine what the nation is. So Sarah, you focus on Hayim Bialik, who is the father of or national poet in a sense, and then Cervantes, who is also considered like a cultural creator. But what about the other, And then Devi, you focus particularly on these kind of formidable characters, the Taranto family and the Widows, who are mostly led by men. And I'm wondering about, this moment in time of social mobility, and where are the women at place, and what do they do in terms of forming these networks?
So I have to begin answering with sort of the confession that gender doesn't tend to be one of the axes that's my first line of inquiry. Mm-hmm. But I really appreciate your reminding me of how important it is, and not to neglect that, particularly in a context where I've basically just given a paper about a woman being written out of a text. Not entirely, but in ways that give her religious and community agency. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure. I mean, yes, like this is a case where you have. This is absolutely sort of. I don't want to say that it's great man history, because I'm situating it within. Because of the ways in which sort of religiously and culturally it doesn't conform to the great men narrative. Mm. However, that like this is clearly like two kind of figurehead men. Yeah. But with that said, there are other case studies that I'm looking at elsewhere in the book where gender is much more clearly a line of questioning for people thinking back about Spain and what the role of women was, who tend to get written out or played down in the historiography. In particular, that happens from the medieval side. It happens with revisitings in various cultural and linguistic contexts of the Song of the Cid. Where the Rodrigo Diaz's wife becomes this kind of rallying point in the modern world for various different writers, both male and female modern writers. So, for example, you have there's a group of Republican exiles from Spain, writers who sort of coalesce around the poet Rafael Alberti. He and his wife were very involved in getting the art out of the Prado before Spain was going to be bombed before Madrid was going to be bombed in the war. But then they ended up in exile in Mexico City and then in Buenos Aires. And his both Alberti and Maria Teresa León, his wife, write these essays that are. They're not trying to be nostalgic about Spain. They're trying to give kind of what they see as a clear-eyed perspective of the reality. Mm. And Maria Teresa is very central in that project of presenting what a clear-eyed history of Spain should look like to the rest of the world. And with all of that said, when I was looking for the editions of her work a couple of years ago in Spain, it was in this little books like specialized bookstore, and I asked for a couple of her titles. And the guy in the bookstore said, ¿Es la secretaria de Neruda? Is that Neruda's secretary? And I said, no, es la mujer de Alberti. And I caught myself thinking like this is how we're talking about one of the really important exiles from Republican Spain. Like, was she Neruda's secretary? No, she was Alberti's wife. So I think it's really something to be on guard about. And anyway, so they have these essays. Leon also rewrites the Song of the Cid, basically once from Jimena's perspective and once from Rodrigo's perspective, in novel form. So she tackles the Jimena project first. So she's rewriting the great literature of Spain from a woman's perspective, and also to Salman Rushdie. In the Moor's Last Sigh, which is often read as the great novel, his great 1492 novel, his 1992 intervention, where he's so clearly invoking the fall of Granada, the crypto Jews in Spain. But it's also the first sort of quarter of it is a rereading of the Cid, where he's privileging the place of Jimena. He's casting one of the spice traders, basically is the wife of the spice trader who takes over the family empire. This kind of, I'll stop here and then segue into, it casts this wife of the spice trader as Jimena and as this kind of powerful force behind the scenes. So I say all of this to say that yes, there is also room for both women's literary production and output in reclaiming Spain in different ways.
Thank you for the is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for the questions. I think there is definitely something that, moments of crisis and where there's a clear sense that the order is changing allows for myth making very much. And World War I was a period where there was so much transition and so much upheaval that you see in a lot of different places the myth making about if we're speaking here of Ladino-speaking Jews or of Jews in the Ottoman Empire and reimagining who they are and what they are to serve current purposes during the course of the war. So if you're looking at places like France, they make up this fictive category of Israélite du Levant that allows for Jews from the Ottoman Empire, whether Ladino speakers or from what would become the Syrian Mandate, to be able to not be declared enemy aliens during the war and to be able to continue to stay in France. So it would be a temporary resident status. So that's also invoking a specific type of myth to accommodate those people. Similarly, in the UK, there are things going on in the war around the place of Sephardic Jews, or when I say here Sephardic Jews, then they come to be called Spanish Jews of they're called Spanish Jews in particular there as a way, again, of creating a legal category that enables those people to stay in the UK and not be declared enemy aliens. And Aviva Ben-Ur is working on that right now. And so I think that this is a continuation of that. And, from other documents that I've looked at coming from Sephardic Ladino-speaking Jews who might have been identified as Ottoman in the United States, that they're writing in to the American government saying that while we are Ottoman subjects, we, like Armenians and Greek Orthodox Christians, are distinct. We're Spanish. We're not really Turkish. We're not the bad guys here. And so there is, in a sense, that myth-making is used for themselves, often as these are men writing in, sometimes asking to serve in the American army and saying, we want to serve in the army, and we can do this, we're not disloyal because we're this separate category, and we're Spanish, as opposed to, we might be in the Ottoman Empire from there, but we're really Spanish. And so different invocations at different places around the world at the same time, where in the Ottoman Empire, this would have been a time where Ottoman Jews were underscoring their Ottomanness during the war. But then this, parts of the same linguistic spheres were emphasizing different parts of that myth making. And I do think, I was expecting to see women appear when I was doing the research more than they did. I'm at a very early stage on the research for this project. It's very clear that all of these men had wives and sisters and mothers and daughters, because the fact that they have wives and sisters and daughters and mothers comes up in many, many articles in the Ladino press or in the Turkish press or in court cases, and yet these women are almost never named. And so they're these sort of nameless women who exist, and I imagine that they cement different types of ties, but I need to do more research to see the role that they play in connecting different types of these sort of commercial or affective networks that we can see. And I was also expecting to see more women of this family involved in beneficence work, because that was quite common for elite Jewish women in the Ottoman capital, not necessarily to serve as teachers in the schools of the Alliance, but to run organizations for gathering donations for orphans, to care for Jewish orphans or for Jewish widows, war widows specifically. So there's a lot of activity around World War I connected with that, and this family was absent from that. And I don't yet know what to make of that, the absence of these women being named, when there were many other women from other elite families, Jewish families, who did serve these prominent roles in philanthropic and beneficent work. So I'm not unaware of it, I just don't know where it is yet, and I was expecting to find it and I didn't. So,
Right.
yeah.
Thank you. So I just have two brief questions for one for each. In terms of Devi, so you're there's this clear distinction of categories or framing the categories of legality and morality in this sense, right? In terms of the trade of opium and how that changes over time. And one can't help to kind of wonder what happens to these families after heroin becomes illegal in a sense in the States and globally, not everywhere, but for the most part. And then what can that tell us in a sense about current issues that are at play in terms of the growing kind of legality of marijuana and what that does for social mobility for certain communities and how that changes over time. This is a 100-year period in which you have these shifts. One in which opium and its trade globally becomes illegal, and then now we have something else that's becoming legal. And so what can that tell us about the future? And then a brief question for Sarah was more about my own curiosity. Two things. So one would be the kind of transliteration of Don Quixote. I am always it boggles my mind why in Hebrew it's called Don Quixote. And I remember being at a private concert by Danny Sanderson, and he was singing this song about Don Quixote, and I was like, what is this? But then I noticed in the German, it's written that way, right? So what can that tell us more so about, the kind of these networks of how this book is being translated across time and space in that sense? And then are there, what would be included and excluded if we focus on materials translated by Ladino-speaking communities or Judeo-Arabic-speaking communities for this same text, right? What stories would be emphasized and what would be taken out in that sense? So, yeah.
So, I mean, one of the things that I'm interested in is what happens, because, what is legal and what is illegal is defined by countries or by international treaties in this period when it comes to opium, and it doesn't happen across the board at the same pace. And so, so when it comes to, say, heroin refinement and the Toronto's distribution of heroin, the boundaries between what is legal and what is illegal is fuzzy, because basically, the League of Nations outlaws the production or the refinement of heroin after World War I, except for specific places for medical use. And what that does is that it moves the centers of refinement of heroin out of the countries in Western Europe, particularly France and Germany, where they had been, to non-signatory states, to places like Bulgaria and to places like Turkey. And so then you have, because they're not signatory states, they don't abide by the League of Nations rulings about this. And so refining heroin within Turkey is entirely legal. But when it's shipped internationally, it becomes illegal through that shipment process. And so the Torontos in the 1930s make claims, the early 30s, that they're not smugglers, they're businessmen, and they use a Turkish word for sort of businessmen of honor. And they distinguish themselves from these smugglers the heroin smugglers who are doing small-scale things, who aren't registered with the government, who don't pay taxes, who don't have this illustrious history, and they do similar strategies of making donations, being involved both in philanthropic activities for both Jewish and Turkish non-Jewish causes. But then Turkey nationalizes. They see that it's lucrative, and they nationalize heroin refinement, and the Torontos lose that in the mid-30s. And during World War II, during the Varlıkvergi, you see this property tax that's levied against religious minorities, including the Dönme in Turkey. The Torontos lose most of their money. And after the war, Leon Toronto brings a case against the Turkish government to try to have his money returned. And it becomes this hot button case throughout the Jewish world of Turkey, because they sort of believe that if he can get his money back, then there's hope for the rest of them to do so. And he wasn't able to. Right, and that family then is also, as a result of their activities in the heroin business, placed on a blacklist for the United States. So Toronto in '56 tries to obtain a visa to come to the U.S. and is unable to do so, even though he's been out of heroin for decades at this point, that he's still on a State Department blacklist for migration. So, this is something that I'm interested in tracing further, but the boundaries of legality and illegality definitely are fuzzy and play out in different ways over time. And what I think it says for marijuana that is interesting is, states decide what's illegal and what isn't, and a lot of that has to do with what is lucrative to a government or to a state and to who has power. And so one of the things that you see happening in Turkey with heroin is that as heroin is made illegal at different scales, that it shifts from smaller refineries and small-scale smuggling to the larger refineries of people who have the resources to be able to do that. And then eventually it becomes the property of the state. And I think we can see similar things happening with marijuana legalization, in that as it's becoming legal in various places, it's really only those who have business backing, who are able to, who have large quantities of capital, who are able to be involved in the legal side of it. And it's still illegal for those who are small-scale growers, or for certain communities of color, particularly, who don't have the same access to networks of power and capital.
Yeah, they're just petty smugglers who don't pay their taxes. Right,
exactly. Exactly. So I think there are a lot of parallels to be drawn, or lessons to be learned from it.
Sarah?
Quick. So the question about the transliteration and the how he ends up being called Don Quixote really has to do with the history of translation of the novel. So this point in Spain is, this is like nerdy and sort of not broad thematic answer as far as that goes, but the sibilant set in Spanish was collapsing at the point at which Quixote was written, and so you see tremendous variation reflected in writing about how various sibilants were sibilant consonants were pronounced. You lose the sh sound from that is represented by the X, or now the J in the modern spelling. So it just has to do with how quickly Don Quixote was translated. Before the second part was even published in 1615, the first part was translated into English and French already. Right. So they're hearing it as read as Don Quixote, and transliterating it out that way. So it's just an artifact of a moment of great change in Spanish phonology and translation in England and France. And just as an aside, I have British colleagues who today will Hispanists who refer to it as Quixote.
Yes, I've heard that as well.
So
That's how it's spelled, right?
Yeah. And the question of sort of the what a Ladino or what a Judeo-Arabic community might look for. One of the things that makes me wonder is there's, as far as I know, and maybe Lil can correct me, I don't think there is a Ladino translation of. There is, okay.
Spanish from 81, a partial version.
Okay.
Do you know what country it was produced?
I think it's from Istanbul.
Makes
And
sense.
I know
Oh.
from Saloniki there was a transliteration project, but I don't think we have evidence that they started, but I don't think we have the transliteration of the Quixote. So there is a partial.
So obviously that's something that I would need to look into. I mean, the question that it raises for me is what translating it into Ladino would do for claims within Ladino-speaking Jewish communities to sort of linguistic ties back to Spain. Like, what is, people talk about Spanish as the language of Cervantes. And one occasionally hears Ladino speakers describing themselves as effectively speaking 16th century Spanish. Whether that's linguistically correct, I'll leave aside. But so I would wonder what translating this novel in particular out of Spanish into Ladino, out of Castilian into Ladino, would do for linguistic claims to Spanish heritage. I also don't know about it. I don't think there is a Judeo-Arabic translation. There are three. There is.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So,
But it's not called Don Quixote.
What is it?
I completely forgot, but it's just like an explanation of what the story is. That's how the title is.
I will
right?
hit you up for
please
bibliographic
do.
reference,
Yeah.
because that's fascinating.
Yeah.
But there are three translations into modern standard Arabic. And where that really gets to sort of identitary claims is it comes back to the question of how do you render the title and how do you render the name. You are a modern translator in 1950 in Egypt. What kind of connections do you want to make on linguistic grounds? And so the three different translations, they're all slightly different. One is Don Quixote with a ha, one is Don Quixote with a shin, and I think the third is with a ha. So sort of like, and also with the author's name. Do you render it with sin, slod, or tha to reflect the thetheo in contemporary but not 17th century Spanish pronunciation?
Right.
So that's where I would see those claims, but I'm actually really interested to see what a Judeo-Arabic translator would do with that.
Thanks. So we're gonna open it up to the audience. I know Ross is eager to ask questions, and then we have one more. We're gonna just take everyone's questions at once. Jeff, Ehud. Yep. Anyone else? Yeah, I got Carla. Sorry, Amira. Yep. All right. So Ross.
More a couple of comments. I can take a vote here. I'm sure everyone agreed this was the most pleasurable panel.
Thank you.
It was a lot of fun.
Because we kept it short.
Yeah.
No, not at all. It wasn't that. No, because it was going on as far as we're concerned. So I think you outlined a Bialik method, really a madness in his method. In that most authors, when they immerse themselves, forget about the Quixote translation, but say the medieval Hebrew, there's some effect on their own writing. And he's erasing, in both cases, the historical place, and in terms of literature, of both the story and the poetry, which underlines how he's single-minded. He wants to create a national language and a national literature.
And he wants it to be European.
And he wants to be European. He does the same thing with rabbinics. Sefer HaGadah, which he edited with Ramonitsky, is, while it provides access to a Hebrew readership audience of rabbinic lore, it completely takes it out of its classical rabbinic context. So he renders it into kind of folklore. It's exactly the same thing that he's doing there, of erasure, really, of where this literature came from and what it meant for the people who produced it and people who copied it down through the generations. And I'm sure you've thought of this, but since I'm thinking of it now, I want just to say it. You have a fascinating disparity between how the early modern pre-state Hebrew author who has this project in mind denudes that context of his sources with your work on Amichai, who is in the post-state period, who's completely comfortable with it, more confident of being able to utilize it as a source of literary imagination, and then go with it, particularly in the case of the Nagi.
We're gonna just take everyone's.
We're collecting questions.
Yeah,
Okay.
we're collecting. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for this. I'm very interested in your breakdown of 3 senses of Sephardic culture at play here. And what I suggest is that Bialik's Zionist orientation really has to do with the way he relates to each 3 of those. That is, you say that his idea of Sfarad as Al-Andalus doesn't play a large part, a role for him. My reading of Vital Levy's article is that, in fact, he saw himself as an heir to the Andalusian Hebrew poetic tradition, and that's actually very important in terms of his image as a Jewish poet. Ross, I don't know if you would agree with that or not.
I mean, I read Levy's article, and I'll have to go back and reread. I had understood.
She does. It's not the main part of it.
Right, no, but I had understood her to very much be contrasting Tzemach with Bialik, and Tzemach trying to, in effect, impose, like, to remind Bialik of what he wasn't doing. But I will go back and.
Look at that again.
Okay.
I think it doesn't contradict what Sarah was saying, because he can claim himself to be an heir while dissociating the poetry from the society that produced it,
Mm-hmm.
and the historical moment that produced it.
Sure.
And I think that that's what Sarah was pointing out to. So I don't think there's a contradiction.
Okay, but in any case, that is part of his, that legacy is very much part of his own understanding of a modern Hebrew poetry that draws on that tradition.
What's really interesting is that Sherman, who wants to make Hebrew poetry be part of world literature, and who, like Bialik in a way, salvages a lot of this literature for his particular age, and serves a very important function in doing that, but also wants to present it to a nascent Israeli audience. He also, in some very, even more bizarre way, is erasing some of the significance of the context, because he just wants to serve up the literature to Israeli society and to claim that Hebrew literature is part of world literature.
Mm-hmm.
It's related.
With the world being
But then
Europe.
But what I'm aiming at
With the
here.
world being Europe,
What I'm
exactly.
aiming at here is that there's a compartmentalization of all things Sephardi in his mind. And so there is this Al-Andalus poetic tradition that has this role. When he thinks of the Sephardi diaspora, we all know the saying attributed to Bialik, I hate Arabs, they remind me of Sephardim.
It's reported in 2 ways, actually. It's that way, but then conversely, how could I hate the Arabs because they're so like Sephardim? And that reporting also enraged certain elements in the Sephardi community.
We don't.
I think they both probably are.
But in any case, he did have the secular Zionist general attitude about Sephardim, and so I think Levy's article really complicates that image of Bialik, because he was very favorable to the Ode Tzemach, and of course part of it was that Tzemach had praised him extravagantly, but still it sort of complicates that sort of stereotype of Bialik. But then the notion of Sfarad as a modern state is also compartmentalized, and I think you really made that very clear. that he wanted Cervantes to be, as you put it, Castilian without being Sephardi. So I think the three together is his way of dealing with the complications of the Sephardi identity, to compartmentalize them in this way. That's just my sense of it.
So we're going to move on to Carla, then Jeff, then
Just a question about the Torontos. You mentioned in your paper something about marriage alliances and how important they were, but I started wondering if women came up there as agents at all. And then the other one was just about sort of the honor and respectability of this elite family. And you mentioned that, as the status of Opium came into question, it also affected their family status. So you mentioned that maybe the donations were a part of like shoring up that respectability, but I wonder if you see sort of ways in which their respectability gets undermined as business is called into question. And it's really interesting what you said about the women not showing up where you might expect the women to show up. And if it might have something to do with the subject of business.
Jeff.
So the Don Quixote thing, I was going to say that in there, as far as his sources, there's a whole genre of Russian translations of, first of European fiction in general, or European novels in general, that condenses them and reinterprets them. And particularly, Don Quixote was incredibly popular in Russia around late 19th, early 20th century. There's a Yiddish translation also, right, published in Warsaw in 1911. And then also, I think, and it was published in this series of world translations of world literature into Yiddish, many of which were also condensed and abridged in order to make them amenable to Yiddish-speaking, Yiddish-reading audiences. And I think there's also a Yiddish version that was serialized in Der Freund in the press. So that there were multiple translations, both of which were done at the same time. So I wonder, as far as the sources, it's probably in conversation with, I think it's Seltzer who did the Yiddish translation, but also with all of the people who do the Russian translations. And I would see if the same revisions are made in those, because that would be a good source. And then also Mendel, what the historian, right, did is, so it's Binyamin that he called the Jewish Don Quixote.
Ehud, please.
Yeah. I think that what is really connecting Bialik translation to the Andalusian heritage is its choice of biblical language as the language of translation. And this is actually take us to Ross yesterday lecture, because I think that Bialik wants to do very much the same as Al-Kharizi did. Al-Kharizi Tahkemoni was a huge achievement in using biblical Hebrew and demonstrating that the biblical Hebrew is wide enough and flexible enough as a language of its day. Vis-a-vis, the Arabic Mekama and Al-Hariri and I think that actually Bialik, by choosing to translate Don Quixote in biblical to be Hebrew, he wanted also to demonstrate that you can use the biblical language to translate modern classics.
So, since we are all mere mortals and there's food in front of us, I'm going to give you 5 to 6 minutes to have a general response to the questions.
I have very brief. Thank you, Carla, for that. I would guess that with more research, as I said, this is just the beginning of this project, and so there's so much left that I haven't yet looked at, and hopefully I will be able to find more traces of the women and their names even, beyond them being listed as devoted wives and daughters and mourning wives and daughters and mothers when somebody dies. So, it's one of the things that I've found in the 20s and 30s is that it seems like this family goes on an offensive, sort of a PR offensive to bolster what they're doing and bolster their position in a way that they didn't seem to do earlier. So these defenses, these in the Turkish press, in Turkish, of how they're different from these smugglers and how what they're doing is very different, and using these terms of, masculine, like these terms of trade that are honorable terms of trade to describe what they're doing in their relationship. I don't see that in an earlier period. And so I think part of that is, it's not, sometimes it is explicitly a response. So one of these articles came about as a result of a drug bust where someone who was also Jewish had stolen some of another refiner's. Salomon Eskenazi was another big Sephardic heroin refiner. One of his employees stole a bunch of his heroin and was going to send it to his brother in Paris, and it was uncovered in a safe in the Ottoman bank, and then that turned into this big press thing. And then Leon Taranto writes an op-ed in Cumhuriyet in Turkish saying, we're not like them, and we're not connected to what that person is doing. So sometimes it is in direct response to what is happening around them. And I do think that philanthropy is also a method of doing that. To donate not only to Jewish things, but to things like the Turkish Red Crescent Society as that's coming up, or to Turkish aviators. And aviators were a very prestigious and fun spot for Ataturk and for the early Turkish Republic. So the types of donations they're making and what alliances they're underscoring through money, I think, is also an attempt to bolster that status.
Sarah.
Okay. Maybe let me just sort of bullet point rather than trying to.
Great, yeah.
Let's see, just to quickly respond to Miriam, I'm gonna have to go back and kind of re-grapple with Levy's article, and maybe we can talk about it further over lunch. Again, sort of a place where I saw it differently than you obviously saw it. Like I said, I will need to go back and reread. Is that I saw Bialik relating to Tzemach as an individual rather than as a representative of his community. That I wouldn't want to go as far as to say, well, he has this great working relationship with Tzemach, so he can't have had that bad of an attitude towards Sephardim. I think Tzemach is kind of like there's the
The good Sephardi.
Yeah, or the I can't be a racist because I have some black friends. I wonder to what extent Tzemach could be deployed to that effect. Ehud, as far as the biblical language goes, I'd had the same thought. I was expecting his use of biblical language and particularly in the prophetic books to be part of a drive towards a kind of Andalusi tendency, and I having worked through the text, I don't see it that way. He's quoting from the Bible, but he's not doing it in any kind of particularly Andalusi mode. He's quoting from the Bible in the way that any other writer with a Jewish literary background might. So I'm not sure that
The
there's.
language itself is biblical.
No, of course. But I don't know that marks him. That in and of itself marks him as Andalusi. I was expecting that to be part and parcel of a package of literary features. And because that's the only one, to me that doesn't seem like it's enough to call him an Andalusi writer.
No, not call him Andalusi, but okay.
Okay.
Yeah, just doing the same, as the standard of biblical language being the standard.
Okay. All right. So short, sweet.
Okay.
Jeff, thank you for the references.
Wonderful. So thank you both for a fantastic panel. Yeah. Look forward to